Hi, everyone. Just wanted to do a quick audio check. Could someone just let me know either audibly or in the chat if y'all can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. It sounds good.
Excellent. Maybe it'll stay that way this time.
I'm going to keep my eye on you now.
Fair enough.
I don't know. I don't know if you're sharing your screen though. I don't see your screen.
Now I'll go ahead and get the share here.
There we go. All right. Now I feel good. Like I can check you off my tech list now.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm just going to have Word open the whole time. So
Okay.
nothing funny coming.
That sounds good to me. I'll be in the background anyway if it all goes wrong.
Okay. Thanks,
All
Mike.
right. Thanks, Rob.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back with some of you. Good to be with some of you for the first time. My name is Rob Carr. I am a Technology Accessibility Program Manager at Mike's Peer Program down here in Oklahoma. And I'm reporting to you live from Central Oklahoma. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to make more accessible Word documents. And I say more accessible because it takes more than 45 minutes or an hour to get into everything about accessibility. In our experience in working with folks here in Oklahoma and elsewhere, and in our experience in looking at a bunch of different kinds of documents, these 8 things are really, really common. Probably some of the most common types of content that we see in Word docs and in PDFs that come out of Word or InDesign or what have you. The session title is not misleading. We're going to focus on Word because that's one of the most common sources for PDF files, right? You don't edit or create a PDF in Acrobat Pro typically. Usually you're using a tool like Word, InDesign, other authoring tools to create those PDFs. So we're going to focus on Word, and right at the end, I will show you and talk through how to make sure that all the good work you do in your Word document moves over into a PDF as well. So the PDF piece comes in right at the end to close everything up. For those of you who did have a chance to join at lunch, and for those who didn't, when we talk about accessibility in technology and Word documents and PDFs, web pages, we're talking about visual things, visual design elements, and we're also talking about the way the documents are built. So I'm going to address a little bit of both of those ideas over the next 45 minutes or so. And I will demonstrate in a Word document how to use these tools and techniques. We're not going to use anything outside of Office for this session. We're going to stay right here in Word the whole time. I am in Office 365 or 2019. If you're on an older version of Office, there will be 1 or 2 things that are different. And I will talk through those. I won't be able to demonstrate because you can't easily have 2 versions on the same machine. But I will point out differences. So if you're on Office 2016 or earlier, then I'll try to talk through where some things are. With the latest, greatest version of most any authoring tool, you're going to find that it's easier to work with accessibility. And Microsoft has done a lot in 365 and 2019 to put some of these things more at your fingertips so that it's a little bit easier to get in and make the document accessible. So if there's any way that you can, if you're on an older version, if you can kind of nudge somebody to get up to the latest, greatest version, you're just going to find that it's easier to work with the accessibility attributes that we need to work with. Logistically, if you have questions, if you want me to go through something again, let me know in the chat. If you can unmute yourself, then that's fine too. We don't have a ton of folks, so feel free and don't hesitate to ask any questions that you might have. If you want to try to follow along, I will try to describe what I'm doing as we're going so that you don't necessarily have to see the screen. And I'll do that, of course, for anybody who can't see the screen. I do rely on folks knowing keyboard shortcuts in Office. It'll just make it quicker. And if those keyboard shortcuts are common for you, then you'll know where I'm leading you to, hopefully, when we describe what's going on. So first thing in Office, and this is common across Word, PowerPoint, Excel, etc., is the naming of some of these things. We have a few layers in the PC and the Mac version of Office. When you open Office up at the very top, the entire top section where all of your controls are is called the ribbon. So if you hear me talk about the ribbon, it's this thing that's located visually up at the top. And within the ribbon, we have a number of tabs. The tabs are labeled File, Home, Insert, etc., etc. These are the things that are visually beginning at the left-hand side. And if you click or enter into one of them or alt into one of them, then you're going to see the menu actually change. The options will change in the ribbon. Then within each one of the tabs, we have groups. I'm in the Home tab right now. And from left to right visually, I've got a clipboard group, a font group, paragraph group, styles group, etc. So when I talk about tabs and groups, that's really what I'll emphasize. That's what I'm talking about. The tabs are the labels up at the top that you can interact with to open up and expose a different set of groups for each one. So let's get started. The accessibility stuff that you can do in Office, like I said, it gets better with every version. And one of the nice things about the way Microsoft improves the product is it makes it easier on us as document authors sometimes. One of the easiest things that you can do to, again, make a more accessible Word document and a more accessible PDF is to create the title the right way. So if you go into the Home tab, you have a Styles group, and we're going to use this a fair amount, but I'll point something out. One of the options in this Styles group is title. And so you see that and you go, oh, hey, I think if I select title and I type a document title, which I'm literally just going to type document title after I've selected that style in the group, then my title is all set. Here's the tricky part. This is one area where I think Microsoft can improve the way they do this, because this isn't actually a title. Generally speaking, when you use a style in Microsoft Word, you change the way something looks, but you also actually change the structure back behind the screen. Unfortunately, this structured change, even though we used a style, which is really the best way to style visibly these different pieces of content, it doesn't put the title in the right place. To get to the title, you'll actually go into the File tab, which is the farthest to the left. That's where you go in to save a file when it's new. And once you open up the File tab, you'll go down and select in the menu that's visually at the left-hand side, Info. And on this information screen, we've got a few things. We've got some buttons in the middle, and then we've got this set of properties that on my screen is just left of center. It'll depend on your resolution as far as where that actually lives. But in that selection of properties, one of the things is a title. There's a title field that you can type or copy and paste your title into. So you can copy it from your document, paste it in here, and your title is built the right way. This is an easy win. This is an easy thing to do. Proof that accessibility isn't always hard. So right there, we have a more accessible document. When I copy this, I'm just going to do select document title, this text, go into my File tab, go into the Info section, and in the title, I'm just going to do Control-V or right-click and paste, and now the document has a title where it should be. Easy peasy, right? Like I said, that's a quick and easy win. The next thing is also pretty easy, and what I've noticed over the last 10 years of training on Office is that a lot more people are doing this, whether it's because of accessibility or not. Most documents, especially bigger documents, will have section headings and subsection headings, right? You'll chunk your content into logically related pieces, and you'll put a heading over sections and subsections. And those headings do a lot of things. You know, the headings define the structure and the relationships between different chunks of content. So let's say, for example, I'm going to clear everything out. I'm going to be really, really creative because I always am in demos. And I'm just going to put section 1 here as the beginning of my first section. So back in my day, the way we were taught to make a heading was to select the text, and we're going to make it bigger, and maybe we're going to bold it. We'll make it even bigger. We'll make it a 28-point font, and we would call that a heading. Well, this is where the structure behind the document comes in. What I did is I made a bunch of visual changes that are actually meaningless in terms of structure. And that structure is important because a screen reader or a Braille display will look for structure to announce the content the right way. If you've got experience with screen readers and you've run a screen reader over an accessible thing, you don't just hear the text on screen, right? To call them a screen reader kind of shortchanges them a little bit because they actually read content back behind the screen. They read structure back behind the screen. So again, a relatively easy thing to do that I think a lot of folks just haven't been taught to do. I'm first going to undo all of my formatting here and go back just to regular text. So I still have section 1, my super creative section title or section heading. But instead of making these changes over in the font group in the home tab, I'm going to move over into styles. And this is one where it works the way that you think it should. In your styles group, you will or should have heading 1 and probably heading 2 already in place. So these are options in the styles group. This is my first heading. This is my main heading for this particular document. So I'm going to select out of the styles group in the home tab, heading 1. So this creates visible changes, right? My font's larger, it's bolded. It made visible changes that are really important for folks who can see to read the text, but it also changes this little snippet of text structurally. So now when a screen reader hits it, it's going to announce heading 1, section 1. So all that information is conveyed in much more of the same way as it would be read visually, right? So again, an easy win. We've made a more accessible document. Now I'm going to show you a word parlor trick real fast. So if any of you who do training, write this down because people are at least marginally entertained by it from what I've seen. So I'm going to create, let's do 4 paragraphs here. And I just want dummy text. It doesn't really matter what it says. I just want some text to work with without having to type it all out. I'm going to type the equal sign, RAND, then I'm going to open parentheses, and I'm going to type 4, 4. I'm going to close the parentheses. And when I hit enter, it's going to give me 4 paragraphs with 4 sentences each. Ta-da! So there's your kind of useful, but maybe useless trick for the day. So even if you already know all the accessibility stuff that I'm going to show, maybe this is new. Now I have these 4 paragraphs, and I did that because I want to create a subsection and talk a little bit more about headings and what these numbers mean. Because like I said, in the styles pane, in the styles group, excuse me, you have heading 1, you have heading 2. And what you're doing with those numbers, this is where you're establishing the relationship between one piece of content and another one. So this section coming up is going to be section 1A. Okay, so it's a subsection of section 1. I want to make that a heading 2 because the heading numbers, as you're moving through the numbers, you're ranking the sections against each other. So section 1 or heading 1 is the main section, heading 2 is a subsection. And if you were looking and noticed visually what happened as soon as I selected heading 2 in the styles group, it gave me the option for heading 3. Now it's ranking the content. You're not counting the content off. So you don't necessarily want to make your next heading 3. Then let's say, and I'll give the example here. Let's say that I have another subsection of section 1. So I have now section 1B. So this is a subsection of section 1, which means it's actually a second level heading. So like I said, you're ranking the chunks of content. You're not just counting them off. You can go as high up as heading 6. And I've only seen a handful of documents where there are that many sections and subsections all nested together, but it can happen. You have as many heading levels as 6, and that's also what Acrobat supports in Acrobat PDF format. So in the case of these headings, again, we've added this structure, and there are some other things too that are a little outside of scope. I'll give you some Google terms though, because if you need a table of contents, Word will create a table of contents based on the headings that you create, the heading structure that you create. So if you've been manually creating a table of contents, let Word do it for you. There's also a way that you can more quickly and easily navigate through a document, and I'll show you this just real quick. I went into the View tab in Office, and I've got an option in the Show group. It's a checkbox, and it's labeled Navigation Pane. So for later on Googling, word navigation pane is your phrase. If I check this box, it shows me kind of like bookmarks in a PDF. And in fact, it works the same exact way. If I click into any of these headings over on the left-hand side, it'll take me right to that section in the document. And again, it's based on this heading structure that I've applied in the styles group on the home tab. So you get a lot when you let Word make it easier on you. This actually does make it easier, I think, on those of us who create documents, because we don't have to worry about making sure that all of our second level headings visually look the same. You know, we don't have to keep track of font sizes and weight and these little things that can make it visually confusing. Every heading 2 will look like every other heading 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, next one. And this is where there's a difference for those of you who are on an older version of Office, and I'll talk you through it. But the way that Office 2016 and older handle this next piece is different than in 2019. So far, we've got text, we've got some structural elements, but what happens when you have an image? So I'm going to come into the Insert tab, and I'm going to insert a picture. And I've got all kinds of random pictures because I do a lot of trainings and talks and things like that. So instead of having one carefully selected to use, I'm going to put in a picture of a baby elephant with its head stuck in the sand. I can't even tell you the context that I originally used this in, but we're just going to roll with it as an example. When you have an image that has meaning, and that's important, and I'll talk about meaningful images versus those that don't have any meaning here in a minute. But when you have an image that conveys meaning, your screen reading software doesn't analyze the image and try to come up with a meaning, right? It doesn't do that, and really I don't think it should, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. So it's up to us as document authors to provide what's generally referred to as a text equivalent for visuals. It can be charts, graphs, pictures like this, whatever visual you put in, you as the document author need to provide a text equivalent. About 80–90% of the time, that text equivalent goes into a very specific little attribute called alternative text. The other 10% of the time is reserved for images that have a lot of meaning. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, you don't want to use the alternative text attribute that I'm about to show you to provide the text equivalent. You probably want to put that into the narrative of the document itself, right? So just in the text. Because if a picture is that complex, whether someone uses screen reading software or not, if they can visually read the text, it's probably going to be helpful to have that text description for that complex of an image. In this case, I got an elephant with its head stuck in the sand. So without a context here, I'm mainly going to go through the mechanics of how to do this in Office. And then we'll talk about what alternative text should actually be. Again, I'm in Office 2019. When I select the picture, I have a Picture Tools tab and a Format tab underneath that. By default, when you insert the image, that's the menu that you're on. If you move away from it and come back, you may have to select that format again. In 2019 and 365 online, to find that alternative text attribute, you just look up into the accessibility group in the Format tab. On my screen, it's visually a bit to the right. Right now, that group only has one thing in it, and that is a button labeled Alt Text, which is just a short way to talk about alternative text. I click on that button and I get a little sidebar menu labeled Alt Text. And it poses a question. How would you describe this object and its context to someone who is blind? And it says 1 to 2 sentences recommended. So this is where I'm going to type the alternative text for this image. It's going to be more descriptive at this point because I don't really have a context for it. So for the purposes of this exercise, I'm just going to type baby elephant with its head stuck in sand. So again, for this purpose, that fits. Alternative text and text equivalents in general, though, are contextual. And I think Office does a good job of saying, describe this object and its context, right? The same picture can have a very different meaning. This picture of this baby elephant with its head in the sand could be used to talk about kind of the way we sometimes talk about ostriches putting their head in the sand to ignore something, right? This could just be another way to try to illustrate that. So if we're talking about ignoring something and putting your head in the sand colloquially, then your alternative text would reflect that. Or maybe, and I know nothing about elephants, but maybe this is a common behavior, maybe this is a really rare behavior, and maybe the behavior itself is what's important. Maybe it illustrates something about the elephant, I don't know. But if it does, then that's what my text equivalent will be. So when you think about text equivalents for your visuals, think about them very much in the context of the other content. And one of the ways that I try to help people think about it is, if you were reading the document to somebody over the telephone, what would you say when you get to that visual? And that's a good way to think about what that alternative text or text equivalent needs to be, right? Because the goal is to convey the intended meaning. With charts and graphs, it's often more descriptive. It might be highlighting a particular trend. You know, if you're looking at trends of diagnosed cases of COVID-19, then you might be looking in a local area where the count has begun to really go down. And that might be your text equivalent, because you're not concerned about the data points. You're concerned about the overall trend, and that's visually what that particular chart might show. If you're in Office 2016, you don't just get to hit a button up in the Format tab. You actually have to right-click on the image and select, I think it's Format. I think the option is the same. Yes, you'll right-click and you'll choose the option at the bottom of the little menu that says Format Picture. I think that your keyboard shortcut to that menu is Shift F10, if I recall. But if you're in 2016 or sooner, you'll open up this context menu, select Format Picture, and then you're going to have a sidebar menu. Then you'll be able to get to alt text. We have a resource that I'll give you all when we're just about done that shows and details how to do this in older versions. If anyone is still on Office 2010, it's dramatically different. And really, if you're on Office 2010, Office 2010 struggles quite a bit to convert to accessible PDF. So if you're on 2010 or before, then I really think you need to try to upgrade to the latest version, because there are just some things that don't work in that older version. So questions about text equivalence or alternative text? And actually, I'll try to anticipate one. There's no hard and fast rule about how long alternative text should be, this particular attribute. There was a time when some of the screen readers basically would only recognize so many characters, but that's not been the case for several versions. The advice that I give as a rule of thumb, and this is basically what Office tells you, 1 to 2 sentences recommended. I tell folks that if you are beginning to type a third sentence, think about how much more you have to type. Because again, if that image needs a longer description, then you may want to have it out in the narrative of the document itself. And then you can just, in the alternative text field, make a note so that someone does know there's an image there, but make a note that says that there's a longer description in a paragraph or the caption or what have you, something like that. Sometimes pictures are just there to be eye candy. They don't convey any meaning, right? And so in Office 2019, there's a little checkbox at the bottom of the alt text sidebar menu that is labeled Mark as Decorative. That should hide your image. In our experience, it'll hide it pretty well in the native Word format. It's when you convert to PDF that it's not really done right. So I think that that's something that'll be fixed. It could have been fixed today. The way that Office 2019 works, the way that Adobe, the newer versions of Adobe work, they update just kind of when they want to. So this could be fixed, but our experience is that the Mark as Decorative piece, to hide an image from anybody using a screen reader, doesn't work when you kick something over into a PDF. So we'll just all kind of have to keep an eye out to see when that works. I do see a question in the chat that I can't answer, but actually I can. Casey asked, will we have access to this video to review or share after? The sessions as they are recorded are going up onto the conference schedule page. So basically what they're doing is they're replacing the link to the session with the link to the recording. And some of those are going up pretty quickly after the session is done. So keep an eye out Great tip on length of alt text. You're welcome. I'm glad that that's helpful. Okay.
Rob, would you mind if I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. Or no, not a bit. Go ahead.
Okay. The decorative piece, when should that really be used? If you can give a little more clarity around that, because I'm thinking sometimes when content begins with that decorative letter, so for example, if the word is forgive, you might have a decorative capital F. Would that be considered decorative, or would that need to be described as alternative text?
No, and so that's a really good, that's a good example of a design question, a design choice that I would question, I guess. So what you're describing is you have an image that is a letter, and then you move to text. If at all possible, I would try to find a Unicode font that looks the way that you want that particular letter to look. Because when you use an image, you would want to put alternative text in there, but the problem is you just put F more than likely. And that's going to break the way the reader announces it. It's not going to recognize that I have this alt attribute and the rest of the word follows. So my advice would be to look for, my direct answer to your question is that's meaningful, so there should be alt text defined, but think about how that's going to actually be announced by a screen reader. It's not going to be at all seamless. So that's why I would say in that specific case, it's best to try to find a Unicode font that looks the way you want it to, but is still rendered text and not an image. And in general, we advise, especially for content, we advise that people don't put text into images because it has issues, especially if people are zooming to high percentages. It can pixelate really badly and be very difficult to read. But answer to your question, yes, I would advise going with rendered text whenever something needs to be read as text.
This would drill down a tiny bit deeper then. If in the margin you had, for example, information and there was an image of a light bulb or something next to that, and it's now redundant because the image implies information and the text implies information, would that image then be marked as decorative because it's got the redundant text?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I think you're looking less at redundancy and more so maybe a way to think about it would be, what alternative text would I put in there? And is that helpful? Like light bulb doesn't really mean anything unless you're writing about a light bulb, right? So I think you're on the right track with that being a decorative image. It's really just there to add some visual interest. But it all does depend. And that is the tricky part with alternative text, it's always contextual. So in that instance, that light bulb might be decorative. You could use the same image where it does have meaning and it would need to have alternative text, again, just depending on the context. But the context you described, to me, I think it would be okay to mark it as decorative.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So another structural element, anytime you have a list, just let Word format it for you. That's my advice. In the latest versions of Word, if I just go back into my document and I'm just going to type a little bit, I'm going to hit the tab key and I'm going to type asterisk, because a little while ago, that might be how you made an unordered or bulleted list. You would just use asterisks as the bullets. But as soon as I tab and type an asterisk and hit the space bar, Word goes, hey, this sure looks like a list. And it changes it automatically to a bulleted list. In the Home tab, in the paragraph group, you can see that, and you can tell that that's the case because the button for a bulleted list is toggled now. You can also come in, and if you don't want to type to start, you can just go into the paragraph group and select from either a list of a bulleted list, a numbered list, or then they have what they call a multi-level list. And that's a little beyond the scope of the time we have together. But the multi-level list gives you a lot of flexibility when you have nested list items and such. So in this case, I'm just going to show a bulleted list. And when I choose the bulleted list, it did the same thing as when I just began typing and did tab asterisk space. So I'm going to type enough to get to the end of the line, because when you use this list tool, you get a few things. One, you get very important structure. So lists aren't like paragraphs. They're not headings. They're very different structurally. What happens when you use this list list formatting tool, and this is true in Word as well as basically every other authoring tool, what is there structurally is not just the contents of the list, but the fact that it is a list is built in. So a screen reader will hit this. I've got 2 list items here. And the first thing it'll announce is list with 2 items. It'll read the items, and then when it leaves the list, it'll say end of list. So if you're reading this visually, you can tell by the bullets, by the indentation, how many there are, and you can tell when you're entering the list and leaving. And this list structure adds, again, those structural components that are so important for screen readers and braille displays to be able to provide that same information. This is one too, I find a lot of people are already doing it, so keep doing it. If you're not, bring it in. Visually, you don't have to worry about indentation. You can nest list items pretty easily, and again, not have to worry about tabbing things or shift tab or moving margins. It's just much easier on you as document author to use this as well. So there's another piece that I want to talk about, and I'm actually just going to bring in an example that's on this web page that I'll show you all. Actually, I can just give this to you now. I'm going to put kind of a long link into the chat, and this is really a follow-up reference to this session. It goes through all 8 of these things, descriptions, images, etc. This has the more detail about previous versions of Office, but what I really want to emphasize is color. This is one of the big things that we see doing accessibility assessments that people don't do quite right. And there are two things to keep track of with color. This first one is using color to convey meaning. So I have a line graph here, and it's got 3 series of data. One is marked with a blue line, one with a red line, one with a green line. And the problem with this is that if someone can't perceive the difference in color between 2 or all of these lines, it's meaningless. You can't tell one from the other. So when it comes to accessibility, what we don't say is don't use color, because color is a great way for those who can perceive it to quickly consume visual information. What we say instead is use color plus another visible cue. And what I've done in this example is series 1 in this new chart is still blue, but it also has markers along it. It has a triangle at every data point. Series 2 is still red, but it has a diamond shape at every data point. Series 3 is still green, but it has a square at every data point. You can have, with line graphs, you can have different patterns in the lines. It's not as important which visual cue you provide in addition to color. It's important that you provide that additional cue. This is something that we ding people a lot for when we do accessibility assessments, because people just don't necessarily think about what color does convey and how important what it conveys actually is. And so again, if someone can't perceive differences in color, then just think about what this looks like now if it's in black and white. You can still pretty quickly tell which one is which. The other consideration with color is color contrast. I'm going to skip down here. And color contrast is something that could literally be its own thing. In fact, we have some colleagues from Utah who did a conference talk. I think it was a 3-hour session just on color contrast. We're not going to get that far into it, but I highly suggest this tool, and I'll put the link into the chat. This is a color contrast checker. You have to click around a little bit to get to the right version for your operating system. But what this will do is check color contrast from or between the font and the background color and make sure that it's high enough. Office 2019 actually has a contrast checker built into its accessibility checker. So if you have different colored fonts on a different colored background or on a light, pardon me, if you have a font color other than black on a background other than white, it will run all the math and determine this color contrast ratio for you. The ratio that you're looking for in regular text is at least 4.5 to 1. Again, that Paciello group tool, the color contrast analyzer, it's going to run the math and it's going to spit out that contrast ratio for you. And the way that it works, I think I have a slightly older version. It works very much the same way. It has an eyedropper. And this is keyboard navigable, but I don't believe it announces the values of the colors through a screen reader. The new version may. But if I want to check the color contrast, I'm going to come in and arbitrarily change a font color. And I'm going to make it lighter. I'm going to go with a pretty light gray. So just looking at this, I'm suspect. It's a relatively light gray on a white background. And color contrast is really the difference in brightness as well as some of the color itself between a foreground and background. And as color contrast goes down, readability goes down really, really quickly. So this color contrast analyzer, I have this eyedropper, and it will let me select literally 1 pixel. And I can move around with arrow keys once I get in close. I can either do a left click or enter, and it will automatically select this color. And it runs all the math. And long story short, contrast ratio of this gray on the white background is 2.4 to 1. It shows me really obviously that it's a fail. So this is a great tool. If you're working with PDF documents, Acrobat Pro doesn't have color contrast check built in. If you do have text and images, or you're working with logos, this tool is portable. You can run it on anything that shows up on your screen. So it's really, really helpful. We use it quite a bit to do more in-depth color contrast testing. But color contrast is super important. And we, again, make a lot of notes about poor color contrast when we do accessibility testing. It's probably, along with color use, one of the most common errors that we find. And in this case, with Word or with PowerPoint, it's something that we govern almost completely on our own, right? It's something that we determine. We pick font colors and the background colors that they rest up against. So next tip, when you have a link in a document, what folks tend to do is make the and actually Word does this for you. If you just type in a website address and you hit the space bar, it turns it into an active link. Well, our accessibility standards actually say that the interactive part, the part that you click or hit enter to follow, that link itself should be descriptive. It should tell somebody where they're going to go. I typed in here www.okstate.edu. That's actually where our program, Oklahoma Able Tech, is based. We're out of Oklahoma State University. But this is just a website address. And while you can kind of tell what it is, it's much more helpful to have descriptive link text. And what I mean by that, in a case like this, it's really just a matter of typing out Oklahoma State University. And I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to make this into the link. I can do that through a right click or shift, I think I said F10 before, I think it's shift F8. At any rate, I can do that through the context menu. I have an option that says link, and at the very bottom of this, I have an option labeled insert link. In your insert hyperlink box, you've really got 2 fields to pay attention to. One is text to display. Now, since I had the text in the document and I highlighted it, that automatically shows up. Here, the text to display is Oklahoma State University. Then down near the bottom, it asks for the address. And this is where I'm going to type in www.okstate.edu. I'm going to select OK, and that's it. I don't need to worry about it. I'm done. Now, you don't need to use a screen tip if you have descriptive link text. There's still an option in Office and in some web platforms to provide a screen tip. But if your link text is descriptive, I don't think you need to worry about it. I have yet to see a situation where you need a screen tip in addition to descriptive link text. But Rob, you say, what if someone prints this out? Because really on the web, what we say is you'd only have the descriptive link text. In other words, you would just have Oklahoma State University. It's a link. And one of the nice things that Word does for you is when it creates a link, it does the structural pieces we need. So if a screen reader hits this, it'll announce not only is it a link, it'll also announce if it's a link that you visited before. So that's built in just by creating the link. But you think, well, what if someone prints this out? And this is best practice advice. This isn't accessibility standards. But what we suggest people do when you have descriptive link text and you're thinking about what happens when someone prints the document, just put the web address in as a parenthetical, as a note somewhere. So this way, if someone prints it out, they still see it, so they can type it if they can see the screen and read it. If it's converted to an alt format, the web address is there, but it's not the interactive part. Does that make sense? On the web, you wouldn't do this because web pages are rarely printed. The use case as we talk about them is very different than in a document. But in Word or PowerPoint and then in your PDFs, it's not a bad idea to have that web address there. It's just not active. The active is your link text that's descriptive. Most of the time, what we see in existing content, if someone has a paragraph about something and they have the web address as the active link, the link text is almost always already in the paragraph. And so if you're looking at older content and you're trying to think about how to address this, look and see if in a paragraph or a line of text somewhere, you don't already have that descriptive piece that you just need to embed the link into. So then the last bit of advice I'm going to give is to use the built-in accessibility checker in Office. And I'll say this about any automatic accessibility checker. I'm not picking on Microsoft because it's true for Adobe's automatic checker, and it's true for all of the countless different web accessibility checkers that are out there. None of them catch everything. You know, they're going to find maybe 30, 40, 50% of the actual barriers to access. Now in Office tends to be a little higher just because there's less stuff to break than on the web. That's not to say not to use the tools because they are really helpful, but they don't get everything. I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to delete this alt text from this image to hopefully get a fail when I run the checker. The Office accessibility checker, whether you're in Word or PowerPoint, is in the File tab. The info section that we talked about before, where we went in and put the title. And there is a button labeled Check for Issues. It's the second button down. When you select that, there is an option to check accessibility. It's the second option in this 3-item menu. And as soon as I select Check Accessibility, it runs an accessibility check. Now, the reason that checkers can't always catch everything is because they just can't be programmed to find everything. But they're still really, really helpful. So here we have 2 errors, which I expected. 1, missing alternative text. The nice thing about this is when you run it, if you expand the item listed right under, it will show you and take you right to the particular image that's missing alternative text. The alt text field is right there. And as soon as I type a letter in there, it gets rid of that error. It says, okay, you're good to go. So this is another thing that the checkers don't do, which is they can't tell if the alternative text is actually good, if it's meaningful. You know, so even when the checker runs, all it's looking for is the presence of a single character of text, in the case of the Office checker. Humans still need to be sure that the alternative text does convey the meaning, right? So even though this does a lot, and this is a gap that a lot of folks have in their skill set where they just don't know to put alternative text in, it'll save you there, but you still need to actually evaluate alternative text to know for sure that it's good. And I mentioned before, it'll check color contrast. And I've got a warning here that says hard to read text contrast. And it highlights when I select the text that has poor contrast, it highlights and it just says why fix, steps to fix, basically just darken the font, right? So it caught both of the things that I expected to be there. It can miss things such as visually styled headings that aren't actually using a heading style. It doesn't catch those and go, gosh, this really looks like a heading. Is it supposed to be? So there's still some things you need to know, but I still highly advise using it. I'm at time. I'm going to show you one thing about taking all of this accessibility work from Word into PDF. And it's making sure really that you save the file correctly. All there is to creating a more accessible PDF from your more accessible Word document is to go into the File menu and select Save As. And when you choose your folder, you have this little drop down. It's been in Office forever that gives you a file type. By default, it's .docx. When you open up this drop down, one of your options is PDF. So what you're doing is you're telling it to save this file as a PDF. And when it does that, it doesn't just save the file, the text, it carries over the structure you've built in, your alternative text attributes, lists, headings, if we get into tables and other kinds of things, it sends all of that over into the PDF. It might not be perfect, but it is much better than, for example, using print to PDF, which just creates a text-based but not accessible PDF. So that's where we tie in the PDF piece. As long as you create the PDF the right way, it's going to be much more accessible. It's going to carry the vast majority of the work that you've done into that PDF format. So what questions do you all have? We are just a bit past time, but I'll ask what questions y'all have. Again, all of this is documented in the first link that I put in, the AbleTech link. It's basically every single thing I showed you. I want to thank you all so much for your time here this afternoon. I know we're getting near to the end of the sessions. Karen asked, does that PDF save as work in PowerPoint as well? It does, yes. Very good question. And the techniques for alternative texts are the same in PowerPoint. There are some other things about PowerPoint. It's a whole other training. But yeah, the save as PDF, if your PowerPoint is accessible, will carry that over. And if you have Acrobat Pro, it has a converter as well that you can use. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of the sessions. And maybe sometime we'll meet in person. Christy, it depends. You asked about the easiest way to make a PDF accessible for a screen reader. Starting from the source like this is the easiest way, honestly. Getting into PDF accessibility, we're actually teaching a workshop, and it's about a 6-hour workshop to get into PDF accessibility because there are so many layers once it is in the PDF format. The easiest way, if you have the PDF but you don't have the source, is to send it out to somebody, honestly, and have them fix it. Pretty reasonably priced for more basic documents. But the easiest way is to go back to the source file. So Word, InDesign, etc., and make your accessibility fixes there. Otherwise, you need Acrobat Pro DC, and you need some resources to learn how to work with the accessibility in the PDF document. So kind of a long answer, I'm afraid. And I don't want to take up anyone's time for this room for the next session. So again, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time. Have a great afternoon. And like I said, hopefully we'll see each other in person someday.